Uh, okay, brilliant. Um, Next, we have Lorraine Douglas, who's a member of the executive committee of the party and also a former YCL member. Each of these people will speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a Q&A session, and that'll be the time for you to kind of come in with any questions or start any discussions that you might find interesting. All right. There's also the chat open, so if you have any burning questions, you can chuck them in there, and somebody might be able to get back to you. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the history. The YCL was founded in 1921, and it was a political youth organization that wanted to represent and fight for the needs and aspirations of young workers and students in Britain, and that made it quite unique. So it was founded about a year after the party, uniting branches of the Young Workers' League and the International Communist School Movement at a special unity conference that took place in Birmingham in 1921. Much like today, a lot of the YCL's focus, especially from inception, was about organising young workers in Britain's industrial centres. So if you cast your mind back to the situation in the 20s and then the 30s, you can imagine what the conditions are like in those industrial centres of Britain. And as part of that, the YCL organised sports and cultural activities that, prior to that had been mostly inaccessible to working class youth, such as the British Workers' Sports Federation, in which they played an instrumental role. And some members like Benny Rothman led thousands of people on mass trespass of the English countryside in the 1930s, fighting for the right of British workers to actually be able to enjoy the outside, which helped to establish the right to roam. Prior to that, the countryside and the outdoors of Britain was mainly a sort of privilege of the landlords and aristocracy, which in large part it is still today, actually. So I think the YCL grew considerably after the Wall Street crash in 1929. And there are also some certain political conditions that that spurred people onto action as well, such as, for example, the rise of fascism in Europe. There was an equivalent organization in Britain which grew, and many of our members, many of whom were Jewish, organized against, fought, and played an instrumental role in actually preventing that movement from growing, such as at the pivotal Battle of Cable Street in 1936, a mural of which is still in East London today, which you can go and see right next to Cable Street. So the same year, the Spanish Republic called for volunteers who were called to defend the people of Spain from the onslaught of Franco, who led a rebellion of military dissidents, and he was backed up by Hitler and Mussolini. More than 2,500 people volunteered from Britain and Ireland, and as many as 80% of that number were members of the Communist Party and the YCL. And if you're interested, you can go on the YCL's website and see an online roll of honour. It's not quite complete because a lot of the records are quite hard to find, or some volunteers, for example, did not give their political affiliation or gave false names when they went over there. So most common age of these volunteers was about 23. Many of them made the supreme sacrifice, giving their lives in the struggle against tyranny and for freedom for peoples of Spain and Europe. Many others who did not choose to go to Spain, like Chris and Betty Birch, for example, were instrumental in the campaign collecting aid for Spain. Later, when the Second World War broke out, over 10,000 YCL members actually participated in that conflict, whether they were defending our home, part of the Home Guard, or firefighters, or whatever it is, or actually working as soldiers and ambulance drivers on the front line. So I've also taken the time to bring up some images here. So we have some amazing illustrations by our comrade Oscar Strakoz. We can see here an illustration of the British Workers' Sports Federation, Battle of Cable Street. trespass of Kinder Scout, and the Unemployed Workers' March to London. After the Second World War, a new situation developed with the Cold War and nuclear weapons, and the League played a key role in the struggles against imperialism and racism. And in 1945, thousands of youth met at the Royal Albert Hall in London, representing over 63 nations and more than 30 million young people. And this was when the World Youth Conference founded the World Federation of Democratic Youth, which is an international anti-imperialist youth organization to which the YCL belongs today. Our league launched the Medical Aid for Vietnam appeal in 1965, which was hugely successful, and joined the global campaign led by the World Federation of Democratic Youth. One of our speakers, Noura, is going to tell you a bit more about that shortly. And in addition, that industrial work, that's the bread and butter of every communist, continued. So the YCL set up trade union youth structures that kind of helped to represent, those millions of young workers who in the 1970s and what their needs and aspirations were. So here we can see the pledge of the World Federation of Democratic Youth. It was really a call to young people of Britain and all over the world to stand up for peace and against the carnage of the two world wars that had actually wasted so many young people, either physically, leading to their deaths or the trauma that affected them afterwards. Well, here we can see an image of the World Youth Conference in 1945, which was packed. And these are some images of the Vietnam campaign taking place with public activities. Here's Trafalgar Square. This is the handover with comrades, including Comrade Jenny Turner, in which aid to Vietnam was given to the freedom fighters. And we can see the bus that was used as part of that World Vietnam campaign. So going up and down the country collecting aid, and there'll be a bonus point for anyone who can tell us in the Q&A what the most important thing that the Vietnamese people actually wanted from us was. So 60s, 70s, and later, 67 International Youth Festival with thousands of visitors. And in 1968, that's when that aid was presented to the young freedom fighters of Vietnam at the World Festival in Bulgaria. Members of the League from all over Britain made up 2/3 of the so-called London recruits, one of whom, Steve Marsling, you'll be able to hear from tonight. And those social or leisure activities continued. So, we had our own holiday camps, football teams like the Battersea Dynamos, playing amateur football and things like that. Young members of the YCL were active in campaigning in the National Union of School Students for Democratic Comprehensive Schools. That organisation, as well, against the development of racist and fascist groups, that continued to carry on. And in the 1980s, our General Secretary, Mark Ashton, who many of you have probably heard of from the film Pride, set up Lesbian and Gay Support the Miners LGSM group, which joined the struggle against the Thatcher government in the miners' strike of 1984 and 5. YCL raised thousands of pounds for the striking miners. We can see here an image of a counter-protest to an event by Oswald Mosley. Unless I've got the name wrong. No, it's the other guy in it. Yeah. I always get the two confused. Oswald Mosley.
Enoch Powell.
It's Enoch Powell, yeah. It's not Oswald Mosley's guy from the 30s, yeah. So here's Enoch Powell turning up in Islington, I think, in North London. And young comrades have turned out to protest against his presence because he's whipping up racial hatred. Here we can see an event at the TUC young workers asking for the TUC General Secretary to take some action in organising the youth. And I think you'll actually see a young Steve Marsling in
Yes.
in this picture. And of course, you know, different world events spurring on solidarity action, which has always taken place. I mean, the YCL and the party have always been unique in the consistent anti-imperialist position. So, you know, here we are with the party standing up against the fascist coup in Chile, which was supported by the Thatcher government, the British government. So from the 1990s onwards, new generations of labour movement activists and campaigners have come into many more battles, such as the student movement that followed financial crash of 2008. For example, campaign against student fees, student walkouts over the Iraq War that started in 2003, and the youth and student CND, and other kind of peace and anti-imperialist movements. You can see here a occupation and walkout, I believe, from time of the Iraq War. And this is an image from our 50th Congress, which was in 2021. So that was where we kind of marked the 100th anniversary of the YCL. So before we go on to our next speaker, which is going to be Noura, just something brief to reflect upon throughout tonight's discussion. You know, why is it essential to study our history? Every person has a unique part to play in changing the world and building the mass movement that we need to achieve real social and economic progress in Britain. But of course, every mass movement is made up of people like yourselves who make that decision to make their contribution according to the conditions that they find themselves in. So we celebrate and learn about these heroes of the past and the present in order to inspire the new generations of youth leaders that we need and remind us about the values that we need as well. The most important values being commitment, self-sacrifice, and standing firm in our mission to change the world. So I'd like to pass it on to Noura, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Or Noura, do you want me to put up a photo of the Vietnam campaign?
Yeah, you could put up a photo.
All right, lovely. Nice one.
Okay, so I'm going to briefly be discussing my research on the YCL's movements on the Vietnam campaign. So my dissertation had to be based from something during the context of the global Cold War. Therefore, I wanted to do something related to the Vietnam War. However, I wanted to write about something that had not previously been covered before. And since I've always been interested in the 1960s and 1970s culture of youth activism and the rise of leftist groups, I decided to produce something where I could connect the two. But initially, when I tried to look for demonstrations or groups regarding solidarity with Vietnam, I struggled to find information as I noticed that most websites and articles had only covered the demonstration at Trafalgar Square on 17 March during 1968. And then that's when it hit me that there had been like quite a bit of a gap within the research regarding Vietnam solidarity within Britain, especially compared to the US or West Germany and France. And that's when I briefly came across a Wikipedia page that mentioned the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign and the Young Communist League, where it had discussed their bicycle campaign and the blood donors that were sent to Vietnam. And from then, I decided to have a look at the YCL website, and I was really happy to discover the article by Jenny Malden, which included a lot of pictures of the demonstrations of 17 March, as well as the pictures of the bicycle campaigns and Jenny Malden's meeting with the Vietnamese. And that truly captivated my interest. So I decided to conduct more research on the YCL. But unfortunately, I found myself in a similar situation where the internet was lacking in terms of digital resources and archives. But fortunately, I was able to discover that the YCL had most of their archives located in the Marx Memorial Library as well as the People's History Museum. So yeah, I decided to take a trip to both of those where I discovered some really interesting documents about the Young Communist League and the ways they prepared themselves for demonstrations regarding Vietnam and how they used propaganda to mobilize the masses, including collecting donations and gathering support for Vietnam. And it was really interesting to see that the YCL really localized all the activities within different parts of Britain, and then they merged and brought this together for the main events. And what I found really interesting when conducting this research was seeing how the different groups, including the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign and the Young Communist League, merged themselves together for the sake of showing solidarity with the Vietnamese people, despite their ideological differences. And from my research, I could see that the YCL was extremely active in their Vietnam campaign, as they had direct contact with the Vietnamese, unlike the other groups. And they really got involved by sending equipment to Vietnam, including bikes, lorries, motorcycles, as well as sending volunteers and donating blood. And through their archives, a lot of the general annual meetings and the pamphlets, I saw that the Young Communist League regularly drew comparisons with themselves to the Vietnamese people, in the sense that they were in a similar struggle against capitalism and imperialism, and that the freedom for the Vietnamese could aspire liberation and change for the people in Britain in terms of prices and unemployment and the trade union. So my biggest takeaway from this was that the Young Communist League intended to mobilize the people of Britain by making the working class class conscious, and as well as aiming to inspire a socialist revolution in Britain through their Vietnam campaign. And essentially, the main purpose of my research and my dissertation was to really shed light on the YCL's Vietnam campaign, as well as discuss who the YCL was, including who they were, what they stood for, their role in 1968, why they're important to British society, and how they went about raising awareness and gathering mass support for the people of Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And I thought that for an organization that did so much, it was such a shame that so little had been written on them. Therefore, my research sought to provide them with the agency that they deserved and show that they were equally as important as other European or American activists in the Vietnam campaign. And I think that to this day, the YCL remains an important segment in the history of British leftism and political activism, especially given the current climate with what's happening today in Palestine, because it shows that the same energy and effort must continue for other humanitarian issues. But I think it also goes to show how little has changed in terms of right-wing politics, and why it's so important for groups such as yourself to still exist and continue your humanitarian efforts within our society. But yeah, overall, I truly enjoyed reading, researching, and writing about the YCL, and it was really great to be able to share this with all of you today.
Thank you so much, Noura. That was absolutely fantastic. And thank you for, thank you for your efforts and work in researching and writing about that, documenting it, and for also joining us this evening to tell us about it. And just so everyone's aware, Noura's research, or part of it, should be published with full credit to her, obviously, in Challenge soon, hopefully, so people can go online and read it for themselves. Brilliant. All right, so next I'm going to pass on to Steve, who's going to tell us a little bit about his experiences as a London recruit.
Thank you, and thank you, Robin and the YCL for inviting me. to this meeting. It's interesting when you look at the history of the YCL and you realise you're part of that history. It does make me feel a bit old, mate, but we'll carry on. First thing I'm going to talk about is just how I got recruited and how it all started. And as most activities on the Young Communist League, it started in a pub. And that was a pub not far from the Oval, which I later found out, only recently, was the meeting place. That pub was the meeting place for the Chartists' last major event on Kennington Common. So I went in there and I've no idea what the reason I was in there, but I got chatting to this chap who started talking to me, and obviously I was politically aware. I'd been on some Vietnam demonstrations, but I hadn't joined the party or anything like that. And he said, there's a folk club upstairs run by the Young Communist League. Do you want to come and meet some of the comrades? I said, well, I'd love to meet some of the comrades, but I can't stand bloody folk music. You know, I was a jazz fan and soul and, you know, I've not none of that finger in the ear job. So I went there anyway, and they were brilliant. Some of you would know Comrade Bob Allen, who was a full-time official, the London District Secretary, and I got chatting to them. And after going to one of the meetings in Stockwell, I joined the Brixton Young Communist League. I'm not from that area, I'm from the Elephant and Castle, but I joined the Brixton YCL and was soon campaigning outside Brixton Tube Station, trying to sell Challenge and also trying to sell the Morning Star. And we were reasonably successful. We had a soapbox and we did that every single Saturday without fail. I was then asked to go to help set up the TUC Youth Conference, and there's me with a very young looking Pete Kavanagh, who was the secretary, and we were successful. Vic Feather relented. We had a big conference in Manchester where some of you might know we stayed with Ruth and Eddie Frowell, who donated all their vast array of books and pamphlets, and the Working Class Movement Library in Salford was set up. We stayed there. All the chair legs were sawn off and books were holding up the tables and that. And I think I slept on a sleeping bag, and my mattress was tons and tons of Marxist-Leninist books. So a good night's sleep. So a little while after that, I was approached by Bob Allen, who said, I'd like you to meet someone from South Africa. Can you bring along a friend? I thought, it's a bit suspicious here. But he said, I said, well, my mate's Sean Hosey in Islington. I said, that's a great choice. So he said, I'll arrange the rendezvous and make sure you're not late, etc., etc. All right. So me and Sean went along and we met this young, not much older than us, we didn't think, who turned out to be Ronnie Casrels, later a cabinet member of Nelson Mandela's first government. And Ronnie said to us, I want you to go out to South Africa. I want you to take a false bottom suitcase. There'll be explosives and other devices sealed in there. And I want to teach you how to make leaflet bombs. If you're caught, you'll get a minimum 5-year prison sentence, no remission. And before that, you'll be tortured. And you'll also be in solitary confinement for a number of months. And sadly, later on, that's exactly what happened to my comrade Sean Hosey. He gave us time to think about this, and we did, and we said, yeah, we're on. Now, at this stage, I want to make it clear, we didn't know anything about, obviously we knew the YCL was involved because we were members of the YCL, but we did not know about any other person or anything that was going on simultaneously. It turns out later on that the London recruits, of which there was about 60, I think, in all, and something like 70% of those were either members of the Communist Party, the recruits, or the Young Communist League. Personally, I think that's something to be extremely proud of in your YCL membership. So the day came in 1971 when we were to fly out to South Africa, in our case, Cape Town. And we were supposed to be tourists, and we had to behave like tourists, which meant we had to pretend to be okay with the excesses of apartheid, which was very difficult for both of us. We saw the most appalling racism. It's in your face, you know, you can't even sit on a park bench. You can't fall in love with who you want to. It's an awful thing. And when we got back in the hotel, we let off steam a bit because, quite frankly, we were so angry. But it was a good thing because our fear of being caught turned to an absolute determination to strike back at this evil regime. So we were given an absolute time when we had to lay these bombs, and a week went by slowly. Eventually we did. We were to plant these bombs by bus stations, railway stations, marketplaces, anywhere where the African working class would congregate on their way home to the townships. We did pretty well. We had a dodgy timer, and unfortunately, it was my turn to lay the bomb, and it was a kind of switch that you put back for 20 minutes, and then it went tick, 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 and after 20 minutes, the bombs went up. Oh, I must say, no one was ever hurt by these leaflet bombs. No one. It was like a giant firework, you know. They were made to go up in the air like a rocket and bounce down again so that the people, the African working class, could pick them up and read that the ANC are still alive. Because the reason that we were asked to take this task, and this task was handed down to us by Oliver Tambo, was that the African National Congress was in retreat. They were either murdered, their leaders were murdered, or in life in prison, or in exile. And the South African regime was crowing, saying, you know, we'll be in power for 1,000 years. The ANC has been destroyed. You have no one to look after your interests. And so Oliver Tambo came up with the idea that white people, white sympathetic people, could go to South Africa. Why white? Because we weren't involved with the pass laws. They thought every white person was on their side. It turned out to be their Achilles heel. So in 1971, the ANC was in dire straits, and they were absolutely desperate to get the message across that the ANC still lives and that, you know, victory will come. Victory will come. So we laid these. There was, as I said, a dodgy timer. I managed to get my fingernail in because it was going to explode, and just move it backwards like that, and it stayed. So we were lucky. I probably would have got a nasty burn, but we were lucky because we'd have got caught because the thing would have gone off and we were there. So eventually we sneaked in. We took one to their Houses of Parliament there. I don't know if we should have done that. We were told not to, but we were told, you know, stick to the marketplaces. But we had one left over, so me and Sean thought it was a good laugh, and it was really, because the thing went off, and the armed guards, you know, they didn't know what it because we stayed and watched it. But the others went off. They were, you know, the Africans went first cowered because they didn't know what it was, and then gradually they started singing and chanting, and when they saw the messages. What we didn't know was this was the anniversary of the Sharpeville massacre, and this event that we were doing in Cape Town was going off in about 5 or 6 different other towns in South Africa. It was something we weren't allowed to know, because it's absolute secret. It seems odd in the days of Facebook and Instagram and everything like that, that most of us kept this secret from each other for about 20, 25, 30 years, and none of us said a thing. So it was something that we did. We nearly got arrested on the way home. We had the wrong airport ticket, and we started running, and apparently that's something you can never do in a South African under apartheid anyway. And the apartheid regime, a couple of their gunmen held out their guns and said, stop. We naturally thought we'd been caught. They'd found out who did the thing, but it wasn't. It was just no running in the airport. So we eventually went home. About 10, 12 months later, I was asked to go out there again, because they needed some passes needed to be there, and a few bits of money. I couldn't go because I just started teachers training college, but Sean went in my place. Unfortunately, I know I'm running out of time. He was captured. It was a setup, and he got the 5 years imprisonment, 9 months solitary confinement, and was badly tortured at the beginning. Now, there is, as probably you know, there's going to be a film that's coming out this year, so we're told. Well, we've been told that every year for a few years, but hopefully it's true this year. Some of you might have seen some of the special showings of the film, the private showings. We've also, of course, got a book that came out about 7 or 8 years ago, which I know I can see him here. It was edited by Ken Keeble, who did a fantastic job in contacting us after victory was won and the Nelson Mandela thing. And we've also got something written by the London recruits. This is an educational resource. It's got some case studies of who some of the recruits were, but more importantly, it's got brief histories of the Sharpeville massacre, the Soweto uprising, what apartheid were, and the past laws. I'm delighted to say that about a couple of years ago, I was honoured to be given life membership of the Young Communist League for a recognition of what we did. I'd just like to finish by saying what it did for me. The Young Communist League was my university, it was my education. I left school with no O-levels, no CSEs, no nothing. And within a short time of joining the Young Communist League, I was in discussions with James Klugman, who was the historian for the Communist Party and just lived up the road from Brixton in Clapham, and was asked all sorts of questions by him about the current political climate. And I thought, you're asking me, you got a double first from Cambridge, and I'm just an old Millwall supporter. But I mean, it was fantastic because he said, well, why don't you read this? Why don't you do that? And it was my education. I wouldn't be who I was. I was never going to be a teacher or anything like that. And it was fantastic. So for all of you in the Young Communist League, I congratulate you for joining. And it really is the best organisation to get a real thorough education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And for coming tonight and giving that amazing description of what you and many others like another hero who's with us tonight, Ken, did as London Recruits. And just to echo what you say, there's the book edited by Ken Keeble, London Recruits, Secret War Against Apartheid, which you can buy online, I think. And there's also the film to keep an eye out, hopefully this year, and the educational pack, which was co-created with the National Education Union, I believe. So anyone who's a person who works in education or is interested in doing some educational work about apartheid in South Africa and the struggle against it, you might be interested in looking up that resource, and you can get in touch if you want to find that through your branch secretary or whatever you fancy. All right, amazing. So we're going to move on to our final speaker, last but not least, which is Lorraine Douglas. I can see you laughing. I don't have a photo of you from the 1980s, sadly. So do you want me to stop sharing my screen?
Up to you.
All right, cool. I'll just take it back to the first picture and take it away whenever you're ready.
All right. Well, this is like one of those follow that moments, isn't it? I feel like I've got a sudden attack of imposter syndrome. I'm actually a second generation communist, and I kind of resisted my dad's efforts, as one tends to do as a teenager, to join the YCL. I really didn't have much of an excuse not to, since I was in the same school as Sally and Naomi Cohen, who were the daughters of Jerry Cohen, the London District Secretary at the time. And even from like, I think you call it year 10 now, but we used to call it the third year. From the third year onwards, oh no, year 9, was working with Naomi and Sally quite often. I've just got a thing coming up saying, confirm your speaking languages, and it tells me that I'm speaking Russian. So there you go. You obviously can't understand Cockney. We did quite a bit of work. When I was at school, of course, it was the time of the National Union of School Students, the Little Red School Book, and the sort of like rise of the stroppy teenager, really. You know, it's kind of started in the 60s and it really took off in the 70s. And this was in the days of glam rock rather than punk. But one of the first things that I got involved in as a pre-communist was a campaign within the school, and this will sound bizarre in this day and age, but for the right of girls to wear trousers to school instead of being forced to wear skirts. And I got myself onto the school council along with the comrades who were in the YCL, and this was a successful campaign. We won it, and we got a real relaxation of the uniform policy as well, so that for parents who would have struggled to buy the school blazer and all of the designated stuff could actually just buy clothes in the right colour, and that would do. And given that poverty was an issue even back then, when wages actually were relatively better because the working class was better organised, you still used to see kids obviously hard up and coming in wearing the uniforms that that their older siblings, sometimes several older siblings, would have worn before they did. So for us, it felt like a big victory. We had a mass walkout in the school. There was a national school strike. It was all very exciting, not terribly political, just playing up really, but it was interesting. And I think generally at school, young people tended to be a little bit political, even with a small p. There was one incident, actually, I'll just go on to this. When we were in the sixth form, there was another guy who was in the YCL, and this guy looked like a complete Nazi. He was quite fat. Pardon me for body shaming, but he was like a big lad, and he used to dress like a Strasserite Hitler Youth type. He had very short blonde hair. He used to wear a monocle, if you can believe this. And he was very odd to look at, but he was extremely funny, clever as hell. The guy's name was James DL, and I don't know if anyone around here who's a bit older than me might have ever come across him. He was actually the same age as me. And in the sixth form, we used to have speakers invited to come in and address the whole sixth form. And one of the first speeches that they organised, they made the mistake of inviting the local MP, who was the recently elected Peter Bottomley, who'd won the seat for the Tories off of the Labour Party. He was slow hand clapped as he came into the hall before he even got on the stage and opened his mouth. We sat in stony silence, booed him several times, and then James stood up. He stuck his hand in the air and was immediately picked on to ask a question. Obviously, Bottomley mistook his appearance for evidence of support. James stood up and ripped him to pieces. I mean, absolutely ripped him to pieces with Marxist theory, why the common market was not in the interest of the working class, all the rest of it. Slaughtered him. Bottomley was humiliated, couldn't get out of there fast enough. And that was the point at which I thought maybe I really ought to be thinking about joining these communists. I didn't actually get around to it until 1980. As a student, I joined the Communist Party. And in those days, the student organisation was part of the party rather than affiliated with the YCL. And I joined because an older comrade, and this is possibly why they were separate, because a lot of the comrades who were in education were actually mature students at the time, stood up, proposed the establishment of a communist society. I made a beeline, and that was that. It wasn't until the National Student Organiser asked me why I hadn't joined the party, and my response was, well, nobody's asked me yet, that I finally got my card, and that was about 6 months after getting involved. And it was interesting, you know, both in terms of what we were involved in and what the big issues of the time were. We had 2 South African comrades in the Communist Society at the time who were exiles from South Africa. So anti-apartheid was a major area of work, and this was, you know, sometime after the recruits did their work. Palestine in 1982 was the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which woke me up really to just what was going on there. And I'd say I've probably been marching for Palestine ever since. And in fact, I've still got my keffiyeh from those days, and that's now getting a daily airing. The other major issues of the day: CND, anti-cruise missiles, the sighting of American nuclear weapons on British soil, Greenham Common. We had anti-education cuts, turning out and lobbying Keith Joseph, who was Thatcher's education minister at the time, marching for abortion rights. There were attempts by John Corrie to reverse the 1967 Abortion Act. He was beaten on that. And then also for student grants. In those days, of course, higher education was free and we got grants, we didn't have loans. So although we always left skin and always left in debt, it was nothing like the sort of debts that people are having to put up with now. And of course, there were industrial action campaigns. We had the Fleet Street electricians coming out on strike in support of the nurses while I was still at college. Goldsmiths College Student Union was the only student union that had turned out, and we turned out several in support, as Sean Garrity was handed his, I think, £20,000 fine by the High Court, which was promptly paid by Maxwell in order to stop the presses being stopped across the whole of Fleet Street. So there were interesting times. The New Crossfire happened in 1981. That was literally round the corner from Goldsmiths College, where 13 young black people and children died. And, you know, a complete failure and disinterest by the police to properly investigate that at the time. I eventually joined the YCL in 1983 after I'd finished my year, the ubiquitous sabbatical year on the student union. I guess I'd already had something of an apprenticeship as a young communist by that time, so I was able to hit the ground running. In my workplace, I very quickly became a shop steward, housing convener, and so on and so forth. And I got that education within the YCL and within the party. That stayed with me throughout my working life. Like today's young communists, the YCL carried out a number of high-profile actions. I remember one memorable one, and I think Ken and Steve will certainly remember this, when Ian Chalmers and people whose names are now anathema, but you know, Ian Chalmers, Nina Temple, and various others infiltrated a meeting in a church that Margaret Thatcher was going to address. And when we talk about dress codes, they were suited and booted. They were in haute couture, the lot, so that they could get through the door, get past the security. And as soon as Thatcher started speaking, each one of them stood up and started shouting, "Jobs, not bombs, jobs, not bombs," each one of them being hauled out until the last one was taken out. There were about 15, 20 comrades in there. So major disruption, all on the telly, got loads of coverage. Thatcher's response was to hiss, "This is why I fight these people." We got lots of recruits out of that. And it's an example really of just the value really of having high profile activity and high profile actions. I was in the Greenwich branch of the Communist Party of Great Britain, and as soon as I joined the YCL, I set about re-establishing the YCL branch, as most of the young communists by then had ceased to be young. And in those days, the age limit was 27, not 30. We used to joke about the age limit of the Komsomol being probably 60. So we had a real kind of thing about, yeah, if you're going to be a young communist, let's be young and let's, you know, be into the youth culture and all the rest of it. And we were into it in a big way. We had something like 29 members in Greenwich YCL by the time I aged out at the end of 1986. And when I joined, Doug Chalmers of the Scottish Communist Party fame was still the General Secretary. He didn't succeed in his bid to extend the age limit so he could keep the job. And nobody, even people he regarded as allies, was in favour of that. He was initially succeeded by somebody called Simon Warren, who was one of my many YCL lodgers at the time. He didn't last very long in the job, and he was succeeded by Mark Ashton, with whom you'll all be familiar. One of my first YCL major campaigns was the 84-85 miners' strike. And during that dispute, Greenwich YCL, and I'm proud of this to this day, was out every single week during that strike. We covered 3 different pitches, rotated them around the borough. We raised thousands of pounds, both in money and in food collections and toy collections and stuff. And also I used my connections with my dad to get involved with and make connections with lesbians and gays support the miners, because he worked in Fleet Street at the time. So was able to get some links. And the Fleet Street electricians at that time adopted the Harworth pit in Nottinghamshire, which was, I think they only had 60 striking miners there. It was one of the scab pits in Notts. And they kept them out. They kept them out for the duration. My dad came along, brought 2 of the miners' wives along to an LGSM rally in Friend's house in London, which was being addressed by Di Donovan from Delisle Valley. And at the end of it, he handed over a cheque for £1,500, which LGSM had raised for the Delisle Valley miners. And he said, we're a lot better off than you. They were keeping those 60 families out on a tenner a week at that point. I think it's fair to say that Mark's role as set out in Pride somewhat understated his communism. In fact, it barely mentioned it at all. But his work with lesbians and gays support the miners was, I think, a textbook example of building a united front. It involved many young lesbians and gay men, a lot of them already active in various left groups, which itself was a source of tension, but a tension that was overcome by what united them, which was the need to raise money and raise solidarity and support for the miners. The personal relations that they developed led to ultimately the support of the National Union of Mine Workers for lesbian and gay rights at the Labour Party conference and at the TUC for the first time. Resolutions actually supporting the rights of lesbians and gay men. And of course, the NUM led the Pride demonstration in 85. What was it, 85, I think it was. Running on, let me know if I'm running out of time. I was elected to the General Council of the YCL, and I'd served just 1 term before aging out. It coincided with the next major industrial action, the Wapping dispute of 86-87. And it was personal for me because my dad and my uncle were both Murdoch's victims, and my dad was also a victim of the WTPU's betrayal of their members in Fleet Street. Now, by that time, the divisions in the CPGB had reached terminal proportions. Striking printers were being expelled from the party, which played no visible role in that dispute. But nevertheless, we were there every week, the YCL. Mark and I made sure that the banner was there on the demonstrations. And on the anniversary of the strike, there was a police riot as they laid into the strikers and their supporters. It was a freezing day in January. Mark was there in denim jacket and T-shirt. And I knew he'd not been well for some time. I'd seen a bit less of him as I'd aged out a few months before. A week later, a week after that demonstration, he was in hospital with pneumonia, having developed AIDS after being diagnosed with HIV only 18 months earlier. And as we know, he didn't recover from that. In the period that he was General Secretary of the YCL, we saw the Thatcher government's assault on the working class escalate as privatisation, anti-union laws, homophobic and racist legislation were deployed to undermine working class organisation and to divide us. There's no doubt that we suffered major defeats at a time when the Communist Party was imploding. What a coincidence. The YCL throughout that period continued with its activities, but ultimately suffered from the destruction of the party. And so the growth of the YCL over the last few years has been a real boost to the engagement of young people in politics. I'm immensely proud of the work that Robin and Johnny and other comrades have done, and the work that they've done to actually bring the YCL onwards. For me, I think the decision to incorporate student work into the YCL makes organisational sense. Although if we come to Q&As, I'd be really interested to hear how you might work with older comrades who are mature students and who might be above YCL age. I'm pretty sure these things aren't insurmountable, but it remains a matter of interest to me, although I can't see me ever going back to college. But thanks ever so much for this invite. I'm so proud of all of you. I think you're fantastic, great organisation, and more power to your elbows.
Thank you so much, Lorraine, and thank you so much for coming this evening, and also those really useful and practical lessons about, you know, the struggle for unity and the united front in all the work that we do as communists. Amazing. So, without further ado, we are going to move to the Q&A section of the evening. So, if anyone does have any questions or points for discussion, you could just raise your virtual hand, and I can call on you to speak. That'd be fantastic. And I would also note that for anyone who is interested in reading more, apart from those things we've already mentioned, you might be interested in reading the Red Lives book, published and sold by the Communist Party, as well as another book which is called Britain's Communists: The Untold Story. And you can also get in touch if you're interested in finding more about particular comrades or particular issues. Okay, do we have any questions? Oh, thank you, Ken, for putting the website London Recruits in the chat as well. All right, okay, Ricardo?
Yeah, yeah, I was just going to ask a question just to, I didn't think anyone else was asking one. Yeah, I've read quite a bit to do with the Communist Party of Britain, the Communist Party of Great Britain during the 80s period, and you know, the establishment of the Communist Party of Britain, Communist Campaign Group, and I'm just curious when it comes to like, my questions towards Robin and Lorraine. You know, Nina Temple was a former general secretary for the YCL in Britain, and like, what like strands and like what like class forces was like, why did it go the way it did to do with that with like younger people coming up into leadership positions? Because like we, you know, during the talked about like this great anti-imperialist history to do with the YCL in Britain, but obviously during the 80s they had some, you know, problems with denouncing the Soviet Union a bit too much. They had, oh no, I would say they were imperialists. Like the Euro-communist movement was, you know, to like advocate for like British imperialism, and like obviously it ended the way it ended. And I'm just curious, you might want to go into that more to do with like Nina Temple in the 80s. So
Brilliant, thanks so much. I'll take a few questions. Brilliant question. We'll take a few questions and then come back to that. Lauren?
Hello, it's not Lauren, it's actually Josh. But probably primarily for yourself, Robin, but also for the other comrades that have been in the YCL. What's your proudest moment as a member of the YCL?
Lovely question. Thanks much. Any other questions?
I didn't catch that.
He asked what our proudest moment was as a member of the YCL, and that was to, you know, any one of us. Lorraine, do you want to come back first on Ricardo's? You're probably better qualified than me.
Yeah, it was a weird period. I mean, I was sort of like I wasn't on either wing really. I was regarded as a centrist, and I can remember when you talk about proudest moment, I guess one of them was being labelled the centrist with more acumen by the Leninist or newspaper, which was one of the sectarian groups that was terrorising the YCL, I think, at the time. They got short shrift by the National Student Committee and never got back after we told them where to go in no uncertain terms, and they went. As far as Euro communism goes, I mean, I think it's fair to say that I think the party lost its way during the 80s. I think the miners' strike kind of forced a degree of unity that you know was not real, and I think that there was an awful lot of disagreement really about the role of the working class in society. And I think what happened theoretically was this belief that the working class was no longer, you know, the most important force for social change in the world, and that there was a general abandonment of what they regarded as class or economic determinism, which I think was a misunderstanding and an undialectical analysis really of society. And so what you had, I think, was the emergence of a theoretical equivalence between what were called new social forces, so feminism and anti-racism and lesbian and gay politics and, or, you know, all of that were given a level of equivalence to the class struggle in terms of achieving social change. And I think there was a view that it was going to be possible to achieve sufficient social change to achieve justice for society as a whole. I don't think it's coincidental that a very significant number of people who held those views in the Communist Party at the time ended up in the Labour Party, and a lot of them fairly enthusiastic advocates of Blair's third way. So this notion that you could somehow achieve social justice at the same time as managing capitalism, and I think generally an abandonment of working class politics. I mean, maybe Steve or Ken might have a view on that, but that for me, I think was the principal problem. It was just the abandonment of class politics. And while the miners' strike kind of helped to hold the line for a while, not least because, of course, we had Mick McGahey on the National Executive Committee, and it was inconceivable that the party would not throw its weight behind that. By the time we got to the Wapping dispute, and given that the comrades who were in Fleet Street, both printers and electricians, were regarded as hardliners, Stalinists or whatever, which was not the case. They weren't Stalinists, but you know, they were solid working class organisers and effective working class organisers. Most of those comrades were witch hunted out of the party. They were expelled from the party. Comrades like Anne Field, like Bill Freeman. My dad ripped his card up and threw it at Pete Carter before telling him to shove the party. And he never came back. He joined the Labour Party and became active in the Labour Party. And an awful lot of comrades did. I mean, my contemporaries on the YCL at the time were people like Kenny Coyle, who comrades may know, and also Calvin Tucker, who's now campaigns manager at the Morning Star, but is in the Labour Party and has been pretty well, I think, since he was kicked out of the Communist Party. So for me, that's where it was. I've got no doubt that there were agents of the state also involved and at it within the party at the time, and who would have been very active in sowing division and causing problems. It absolutely suited capital to make sure that we did not have an active campaigning you know, outward facing Communist Party. Notwithstanding that, we had some massive events during the 80s, you know, some of them organised by Comrade Ivan Beavis, no longer with us, and who was on the side of the Angels, in my view, you know, like the Beat the Tory Blues music festival at Alexandra Palace, which was huge, absolutely huge, and right right on the money as far as the music of the day goes. Not so much Steve's is more indie and punk and reggae. And then we had the communist universities that took place in the City of London University. 2 or 3 of those I attended, again, were massive. You'd have 2,000-3,000 people turning up to these things. But some of the theory was, shall we say, not Marxist, that was being pushed there, a long way from being Marxist, and certainly not Leninist. So, yeah, I just think it became a little bit too enamoured of social democracy.
Thank you, Lorraine. Steve?
Yeah, can I first of all recommend an excellent, quite a long article, but it's absolutely brilliant, by the party General Secretary Rob Griffiths on this particular breakup of the Communist Party. Then I had left in disgust. I didn't think the party was fighting for the working class anymore. People were openly traducing Lenin's books, his theories and his ideas. The central role of the working class was just rubbished by some of these people. And I was in the middle. I weren't some hardline Stalinist, you know. They'd all gone with Sid French to the new Communist Party. I was fairly, what I thought was fairly central. I had criticisms of the Soviet Union, which was all about that. But on the other hand, I recognised its fantastic achievements since 1917. And so I was sort of cast as a villain or something like that. And it was ridiculous, really. I don't quite understand why these people were getting there. They closed the party down. They formed a new, what was it called, Democracy or
Democratic Left.
A Democratic Left. It lasted about 5 minutes.
And all of the party's assets, by the way, ended up with the Liberal Democrats.
That's right. And yeah, she went to my school, believe it or not. And the money went with them.
Yeah.
I mean, all the party's assets seem to go with them. And my hat's off to those comrades that fought to re-establish the Communist Party. I didn't. I thought it was a lost event. They lost thousands and thousands, but a few people stood there and actually said, no, we are re-establishing the Communist Party. And thank God that they did, honestly, because look at us now. We're gaining in membership. We're actually looking, we've got a young Communist League again, which is absolutely fantastic for people like me. It's just a matter of tremendous pride. So yes, there were people, and I agree with Lorraine, I think some of them were agent provocateurs who tried to close down the Communist Party. Why did they do that? Because the Communist Party is capable of leadership, and the Communist Party is a vanguard party and can lead the proletariat, the working class, in the times of struggle. So it was very important for some of these people, not all of them, to get rid of us. They failed.
Thanks, guys. So before we wrap up, should we answer Josh's question? Proudest moment. Lorraine, then Steve, and then I'll finish off.
I was only jesting about the Leninist, really, but in terms of proudest moment, well, I guess the work that we did for the miners' strike, actually in Greenwich, and just keeping that going over that 12 months, you know, and getting those comrades out. They were fantastic, and you know, we did really well. And to me, it kind of helped to build my confidence really about street work and the importance of doing stuff on the street, being visible, handing out. You know, we sold Challenge, we sold the paper, sold the Morning Star, and as well as collecting for the miners. So we were able to present a public face of the party. And I think that was probably one, I mean, it wasn't a moment, it was a year, but I was very proud of that.
Mine, I suppose it has to be being chosen to be one of the London recruits and meeting the fellow recruits when Peter Hussain invited us to the House of Commons and also being in when King Keeble got in touch with me and said, "Are you Steve Marsling, who once went out to South Africa? I'm trying to write a book and get us all together." That was amazing, and you know, a very proud moment to find so many young Communist League members who I knew, but had no idea they'd gone out to South Africa, none at all. And that included Ken, really. I mean, I knew Ken a little bit, and the only person I knew was Sean Hosey. And to find that these people had kept this secret, and I must tell you, two of the London recruits actually worked together in the same office and never knew about each other's activities. And they'd worked together for many, many, many years. And they turned up to the House of Commons and said, "What are you doing here? What are you doing?" Well, I went, "Well, I did." So it was an incredible moment. And as I say, congratulations to those young communists that took part. Also, congratulations to the international socialists from the London School of Economics who became the SWP. They answered the call, and many, many women went out there, and that was fantastic as well. At least 4, 5, 6 women, probably more. So there was a whole range of people who went out there. But the driving engine for both recruitment and for taking part in what were quite dangerous activities was our Young Communist League, our Communist Party, the South African Communist Party, and the African National Congress. And yes, I am extremely proud of that. Thank you.
I think my proudest moment would have to be obviously no comparison to those like amazing events that you two participated in, but I think our 50th Congress in August 2021, just seeing over the course of you know, years and years, all of the work that ordinary comrades like any of us have put in, reaching fruition, having a really successful, vibrant event where you have so many like amazing new generations of leaders making themselves present, and who are, you know, going to be the people who are taking action, leading the way in trade unions, leading the way in different fronts of struggle. For me, that's the most wonderful thing that I get to experience, is meeting all these comrades and you know, trying to do what I can to, you know, encourage them to carry on their journey and do what they can do. Because you know, once again, it goes back to this idea that it's up to every one of us as an individual to make this mass movement that we have a success. Cool. So I think we're going to end it there. Before you go, I just want to say thank you again to our amazing speakers. Thank you to the Education Commission of the YCL for facilitating this amazing evening's event as well. And, you know, keep an eye out, because there'll be more events to come that are about history of the YCL or different topics. And, you know, I'm sure they're also looking forward to involving comrades from up and down the country as well. So if you're interested in that, contact the Education Commission or whoever from your branch, district or nation who's involved in that commission. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Robin.
Cheers.
Thanks, comrades. See you soon.